GLAAD responds to the weekend of frightening violence against the LGBTQ+ community. GLAAD is the world's largest lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer LGBTQ+ media advocacy organization. The organization condemned a wave of violence against the LGBTQ+ community across the country over the weekend and called for increased protection and support for LGBTQ+ people and youth. New data shows a vast bipartisan majority of Americans, including 66% of Republicans, support LGBTQ+ inclusion in public school curricula. The targeting of LGBTQ+ youth and their allies has hit a fever pitch with an alarming surge of violence against LGBTQ+ people, many of which were encouraged to take place via social media posts. Incidents span coast to coast and include hospitals and healthcare providers serving transgender youth, advocacy groups, LGBTQ community centers, drag events, and more. On September 18th, neo-Nazis waving swastika flags protested a drag brunch after the Texas GOP posted an alert about the event on Twitter. On September 24th, a drag story hour was met with protests and support of counter-protesters after extremists threatened to, quote, dress like ninjas and beat the librarians to death, end quote, if the event continued. This happened in Minnesota. On the same day in Florida, the Pride Community Center of North Florida was vandalized and a threatening note was left by the perpetrator. Many more such events took place across the country. Rising anti-LGBTQ censorship in schools has also hit a historic peak this year with at least 93 anti-LGBTQ school policy bills filed. And you know, this is a direct result of the policy actions that we saw, that we were just discussing. When you tell people that a group is bad, they are evil, they are other, it makes it okay to do anything to them, including violence.
Yeah, I always say it starts with law. If you have a law that has consequences as to like how you treat a particular population of people, that's where it starts, because if there's no protection legally, then anyone can do anything, right, and there's no consequences. Eventually, once the law has been set in place, then hopefully it trickles down into society and people get with the program. But if there's no protection and there's laws against our community, then, you know, what are the consequences for people when they want to act out against us?
I'm curious. The GLAAD statement, I think, is very powerful, and it's sobering for us, for them to connect the dots. Wait, you're thinking about this in Florida, but this is not a Florida phenomenon. It's going on in Minnesota and Wyoming and. I'm curious to the point that you just made. A lot of the rhetoric violence that is the drum that's being beaten is against the trans community. Have you noticed that at all in 2022? Have you become more uncomfortable in terms of your experience here in South Florida, or has anything changed?
Yeah, okay, so it's interesting, and that question is excellent. Okay, so 10 years ago, when I would leave my house, I felt like I had to put on my war gear. Like, it was more like people were like, oh my God, like deer in headlights when they saw me. And I just felt like it was a combative type of thing. Well, then there was, you know, the shift, and there was some progression going on, and me going out in public wasn't as hard, like going to the market or the gas station or the post office. But now I am noticing that here and there, I tend to feel the energy, like the way people look, like the looks of disdain. Mm-hmm. It's not as bad as it was. So I think like the progression is still there and it needs to be acknowledged. But at the same time, it's scary because could it revert? Mm. Could it go back to where it was? And even 10 years ago, 15 years ago, 20 years ago. So yeah, I have noticed it. And I think people become brazen when there's like rhetoric and there's, you know, fire, for lack of a better word, under a particular thing, movement or for particular mentality. People get brazen with their hate and discrimination because it's like
called January 6th.
Yeah,
what that
exactly.
I'll never understand, as long as I live, I will never understand people's preoccupation at how other people live their lives. I don't get it. Like when I'm 80 years old, I don't want to look back on my life and say, I've spent my entire life trying to change everybody else. I want to concentrate on my own life, you know?
How do you feel after you turned 80?
Well, fortunately, I was prepared because he gave me 5 years notice on it.
You're like, why now?
Right,
Tell him
exactly.
you're like, why?
No, it is.
I'm like the sour grapes.
There's good news. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, I think what's really interesting for you, Reggie, is that you're actually in a safer, more inclusive environment as a community that we live in. We may live in a state that's not accepting, but we all live in a community that is more accepting and more understanding, and yet you're feeling that here. Imagine being in Alabasta, Alabama, you know, or seriously,
Or Gainesville.
or somewhere in the other state of Florida.
It's interesting you say that because I just got back from Fort Walton Beach, Destin, Florida. I went to a conference there. And one of the people that went on the conference, they grew up in Panama City, which is an hour away. And we had an afternoon free. We had gone to morning workshops. So she kept bugging me to like, let's go to Panama City. She wants to see her hometown. Well, let me tell you, I mean, Fort Walton Beach, Destin is a little touristy, so I didn't feel as like, oh my God, but I was getting the looks and like you could feel the energy. But when we got into Panama City, you're talking about Panhandle. And yes, so definitely, I do not take living in South Florida for granted. If you're going to live in this state, you know, so.
I want to remind us, there's some good news in this report. First, you hear the reporting, and every report, every survey, every poll comes to the same conclusion. It's roughly 2 to 1. This report that GLAAD talks about, 66% of Republicans support LGBTQ in schools in support. That's 2 to 1. Remember, 2 to 1 are supporting you. What that reflects is we are dealing with a powerful minority. The powerful minority is ginning up. Ron DeSantis and Lindsey Graham's and the Nebraska senator and are the ones that are, and Tucker Carlson, are ginning this up. It is a minority, however. They're just a super loud minority. There's good news in that it is a minority. But in that minority, we must remember our history. In the 1930s, Glenn and I have talked about this so many times, all of the statistics, all of the brightest minds have said Nazism was not the majority thought in Germany. They were just the loudest, most powerful voice. And they got more power and more power and more power. And then they squelched any opposition to them. Where are we watching that today? 80 years later, we're watching that in Donbass, in the Ukraine and Russia, where they're going in to say, let's have an election to see if you want to leave. And by the way, the guard that's standing next to me with the machine gun, here's your ballot. That's what's happening in minority
Italy
voice.
Just elected a fascist leader.
Yes.
And the last time that party was in charge, they eliminated Democratic votes.
Yes.
They got elected democratically, but then took that power and all through Europe you saw that before World War II, where we had these fascist governments going in and they were the minority, but they had the power.
So it's the good news and the bad news. The majority, even in Republicans, support us, but we have to make sure that we stand up against this minority voice, because if we don't, they embolden themselves to get stronger and stronger to the point where we won't be able to stop.
It's like cancer. Like it starts, it's a little bit and then spreads and spreads. That's what comes to my mind.
It's a great transition for you, because let's talk about a cancer in the story you're getting.
Yes, definitely.
LGBTQ plus news is vital for our community and for the broader world as a whole. We have enough enemies at Fox News. Tucker, Sean, and Laura are loud. We need passionate allies. Happening Out television network, Queer News Tonight, and It's Happening Out are literally out of the closet and into the headlines. Our community needs your support. Like this broadcast and subscribe now to ensure the growth of the entire LGBTQ plus community.